I have to begin anew. So thank you also from my side to be together tonight. For you tonight, so in Germany it's almost 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm very proud to be back in this school. I first saw it almost 20 years ago, and it was a deep impression for me. I couldn't believe that the Waldorf School is so close to the Central Park. And this has a little bit to do with my topic for tonight. The topic is Steiner in the public. I had no chance as a child to go to a Waldorf school. I had no parents who had any relationship to Waldorf education. I think I first heard the name anthroposophy when I was 21. Even if I grew up in Stuttgart, which seems to be the center of German anthroposophy, I never came across it. Sometimes anthroposophists say anthroposophy is now in the center of our society. I don't know which society they mean, because the society where I grew up, there was no anthroposophy. And when I encountered it at the beginning of my medical studies, I became very fascinated by Rudolf Steiner and his spiritual science and also the practical, I wouldn't say application, but the manifestation, because I studied close to an anthroposophical hospital, Herdecke, and I could see there that this is another type of medicine, also of nursery, of another type of relationship to human beings, in this case, patients. And I started to read Steiner as a scholar, as a student. But the strange phenomenon for me that he was unknown. I mean, he was very much known in Herdecke, and in the bookshop they had collected works. But I came from other cities, and nobody knew Rudolf Steiner. In my own school, he was never named. Of course, we had some German philosophers or writers, thinkers. It was a normal school, what we call a gymnasium. Steiner was never a theme, unknown. And I remember when Christopher Bamford, some of you will have known him in the United States of America. He was a co-worker of Jean Gallegly in Steiner books. And Chris said to me, it was in Great Barrington, we had a little walk together, he's the most unknown person, Steiner, of the 20th century. And Chris was a real thinker and a very meditative person. And he said also to me, you know, it's maybe also a kind of protection that he is not so known. Even if there are some biographies, and I think the biggest one I have published in Steiner books, 7 volumes, 2,000 pages, but still unknown. And then I came to New York with Jean Gallegly. I think Chris was not part of this little excursion, and I gave a lecture here in the school 20 years ago, but I was fascinated because for me as a European, and not a New Yorker and not familiar with the United States of America, the Central Park was really always the Central Park. For me, it was an enormous place. Of course, from puberty and adolescence, this was Simon and Garfunkel, which was not bad. But it was not only Simon and Garfunkel. Many other writers, thinkers, many other important events in the history of the 20th century around here, and that this Waldorf school was just right here. I could imagine that it's difficult because it's quite expensive here and so on, but I found it very important as an inner subjective feeling, not a remote place. even if I also like remote Waldorf schools on the landscape, I found it very important that it's right here, so close to these other places. But coming back to my theme, Steiner in the public. So because of this unknown person, Rudolf Steiner, seemingly unknown, it seemed to be so important for me that we also keep some central places near central gardens, central parks. As you know, Hannah Arendt was mentioned. She was really in the public. And coming back to my first encounter with Rudolf Steiner, in this hospital, I started as a scholar to read Steiner. First of all, the completed works, and I started really with volume 1, 2, 3, and so on. But later on, all the biographies, because as a student, or maybe I could have also been a high school student, but I was 21 years old, I thought, who is the man behind the books? Who is the man behind the books? Or in the books? When Jean Gallagly came to me first in Switzerland and wanted to invite me for coming to US, he said, I want to bring your books to the United States. I will translate them. I say, which book? He said, all of them. In the meantime, these are more than 200, but in fact, Jean brought 50 books or 55 books in his lifetime. And I was shocked because I thought one book is enough. But he said, no, we will do all of them, but you have to come. The Americans won't read without knowing who is the author. So it was a very strong principle of Jean Gallagly to present authors. The man or the person or the woman behind the book or in the lines. Steiner said in one of his books, regard this book as a kind of an encounter, a kind of a being together with the author. And in fact, this is the mystery of the books. And I loved my books when I grew up in a house without books. My parents were not readers, are still not readers. So for me, the first books were a real discovery. And let's say the encounter with Franz Kafka or Rainer Maria Rilke or other poets, yes, in a small little village nearby Stuttgart, this was an unknown world for me, but really spirits. Spirits, also spirits of comfort. Sometimes, as it is described by Dr. Steiner in his esoteric lessons for the Michael School, sometimes it's very dark on earth. Also for some children or young souls in puberty and adolescence, they don't know. In this kind of darkness, in the physical realm, they're looking for stars, but there are some times of development where we can't see the stars. Sometimes the stars are very helpful. I had a teacher of astronomy, and he really showed us the stars, which was important. But later on, I had the feeling that I was looking for spiritual stars, really for kind of deeds. And books, for me, became deeds, because an author is inscribed. A spirit is inscribed. So from behind the books, they are written, they are done by a thinker. And so for me, it was an enormous discovery, literature in general, at school. It was a good school. It was just a normal school. And I wouldn't say the majority, but some of the things we heard in the preceding lecture about learning and education was present at this school. It was not a Waldorf school, but it was a real school. And then I came to this anthroposophical hospital, and a new encounter with another author, a philosopher, a thinker, more spiritual than my preceding stars, but so unknown. And this became difficult for me in a certain way, that it seems to belong to a special family, the anthroposophists, which was for me a strange word. And it's still for me difficult if somebody asks me, are you an anthroposophist? I wouldn't deny. I wouldn't deny, but to say yes, who can pretend to say that he's an anthroposophist? This is an enormous proclamation, I would say. It's even difficult to say I'm a Christian, because this is an enormous burden to pretend that you are a follower of the Christ. So, but independent of the name, there was a group of people, they all knew Steiner. But this was an enclosed community. And I tried to find out what is the riddle behind. For me, Steiner couldn't be just a star on earth, in the sense that he must have been a child. He must have been a person learning from teachers. So part of the literature was about an initiate, and this initiate seemed to be born as an initiate. So I thought it can't be right. Steiner must have been also a learning person. And if he was such a genius as I imagined he has been, from what I experienced, others must have witnessed him. Other people who are maybe no anthroposophists, but spiritual persons. And I was studying a lot of books about Steiner, biographies. 95% were anthroposophists publishing about Steiner. And then there was a very thick book, Memories on Rudolf Steiner, and the same. They were all followers or friends, but there was one exception. I knew the name, Albert Schweitzer, the doctor from Lambarene. I was fascinated. There was a text, Personal Memories on Rudolf Steiner, a long text, and signed Lambarene, 5th of November, 1960. So obviously Dr. Schweitzer, age 85, because he was born in 1875, has published a text about personal memories, very positive on Steiner, 5th of November in Gabun, which is the modern name of the famous Lambarene hospital. And for me, as a student, medical student, but not independent of medicine, Albert Schweitzer was a famous man, and probably you know, in the 60s, together with John F. Kennedy and Mother Teresa, was the three most famous persons on earth. Positive about Steiner. And some of you will know this text very well. Until this year, I couldn't find out the origin of this text. And I started this year at the Goethe-Anum with a memorial lecture, 14th of January, about Albert Schweitzer, because he's born 14th of January in 1875. That means this is also for him a special year, 150 years of birth. And the topic of the lecture was his relationship to Rudolf Steiner. Mainly I talked about Schweitzer, but also about Steiner. And first time in my life I really connected with the Schweitzer archive, which is not so far away from the Goethe-Anum, nearby Colmar. And they were very friendly. And I asked several times about letters to persons known as anthroposophists, because I knew before there is no correspondence with Steiner directly, but I wanted to find out details of this relationship, because, as I mentioned, it was a kind of comfort to me as a medical student to see that at least Albert Schweitzer recognized Steiner. So this was for me comfort to my soul that such a person with this ethical quality and world horizon, and I mean, you know, he was a Nobel Prize winner, and he was not only a famous social doctor in Lambarene, which would be enough to found such a hospital. When Dr. Schweitzer died, a third of the population of Gabon, at this time 420,000 people, a third of them were patients in the hospital in the last decades of Albert Schweitzer. And the result of this, that they have been patients in the hospital of Gabon, of Schweitzer, the result of this, that when Albert Schweitzer was in the process of dying, age 90, they heard about it and they started to come to say goodbye. It was, by the way, a very special form to die, because Albert Schweitzer in his last days slept. Over 5 days he just slept. And they realized this will by a metamorphosis go to an eternal sleep. And they collected. People came from the neighborhood, because whispering in the forests, he's in the process of going. But I think it was the third day, and some weeks ago I spoke to a person who was witnessing this situation. Suddenly he awakened again and said to the doctor beside and the nurse, I want to go out of bed. I want to see my hospital again. So they helped him to stand and to go step by step. He left the house, and there were a lot of people gathered there. And he knew why, because he was in the process of dying. And then he wanted to go to the big river, and then to turn around and to see from the river Lambarene. And that's what they did together. And he said, isn't it beautiful? And then he went back. Another 2 days, and then he died. And at this time in Gabon, the rituals after somebody has died took over 1 week in singing and dancing. In the case of Albert Schweitzer, it took 3 months, because the population came from so different parts. So he was this doctor, but he was also the European leading specialist for Johann Sebastian Bach's music, especially the organ music. He was an excellent player of the organ and financed the hospital by his concerts. But not only he was an expert of playing, he was an expert of the instruments. He knew how the organs should be built. Then we know that he had a PhD in philosophy, a PhD in medicine, yes, and a PhD in theology. Before he started to study medicine, he was professor at a university in Strasbourg for theology. Such a man. Memories to Steiner. But now at the beginning of the year, and I come back to the Central Park with this story, shouldn't be too long. I keep it in mind, also for my own sake, in the middle of the night. The story with this text of Schweitzer started here at the Central Park. And you know, I don't know, but maybe you know, when Steiner's 100th birthday came in 1961, they planned, the anthroposophists of New York and other places planned to have really a festive coming together here in New York. And they were thinking how to do it, that it's the level of Steiner. And especially three very important people came together for the program. The one was Henry Barnes, of course. The second was Friedrich Hebel, Professor Hebel, later on in the executive board of the Goetheanum, but at this time, you know it better than me, in Long Island, in the school. And the third one, maybe the leading one, was Bruno Walter. Famous person, you know him quite well. And he was here at the Central Park in 1960 because there were two major events in the musical New York story by Bruno Walter. He was leading the New York Philharmony for Gustav Mahler's Song for the Earth. This should be performed for the 100th birthday of Gustav Mahler in the presence of Anna Mahler-Werfel. During the concert, she was sitting in the first row beside Friedrich Hebel. And the other main event, almost the same time, was the Requiem of Verdi in the Carnegie Hall, also by Bruno Walter. He was both orchestra, and they trained, or he was living in a hotel in the southern end of the Central Park, so very close to, and on the upper floor. And it was obviously a very rich hotel because Bruno Walter had there not only a piano, a huge instrument, and the solists from the two orchestra came to him for personal training. And Friedrich Hebel described the situation very wonderful because he joined these trials of this coming together. And when there was a break and no other solists came to Walter in the apartment of the hotel, they were sitting there in this upper floor of the Manhattan Hotel, looking to the Central Park, thinking whom to ask to contribute to the Steiner birthday event. And then Bruno Walter said, I will ask Albert Schweitzer. Because he came across, he did not know before, but he came across by an essay of Albert Schweitzer, he realized that Schweitzer knew Rudolf Steiner. And there's a wonderful letter from Bruno Walter, which I detected in the archive of Albert Schweitzer at the beginning of the year, when Bruno Walter said they were in contact since 20 years as musicians. But then Bruno Walter said, I recently came across this very, for me, enthusiastic news that you also met Rudolf Steiner and appreciated him. And now I would like to ask you if you please could contribute with a personal memory to our New York birthday meeting for Rudolf Steiner. And this letter went then to Africa, to Lambarene. And in the answer, Albert Schweitzer said more or less, yes, I will do it. I would need a modern biography of Steiner with an overview of his work. I met him, but would be a help. And then a lot of books came from California to Lambarene, not only biographies from Rittelmeyer, from Emil Bock, and something from Albert Steffen, but also Steiner's main works, and also the autobiography Mein Lebensgang, and some other about from Jesus to Christ, and so on, Christology, theology. And in the answering grateful letter, Albert Schweitzer is writing to Bruno Walter, thank you very much. To be honest, I have these books already, but they are in my house in Alsace, in Günzbach. So it's good to have them here in Lambarene now. So very nice conversation. It's not all from Central Park because, as you know, he lived in Beverly Hills, Bruno Walter, but it started here. The idea to ask Albert Schweitzer, and then maybe you know, or some older anthroposophists, they know more about this gathering. I think it happened not in February, but in April 61 with Henry Barnes and the other ones. And this text by Albert Schweitzer was read. And it was a big, big surprise. Because, as I said, he was one of the most famous persons on earth, in correspondence with John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev to stop nuclear atom tests. But not only with John F. Kennedy, who was full of respect towards Albert Schweitzer, he was a moral authority, also a spiritual authority, but not only with the politicians. You know, he was a friend of Albert Einstein, but also of, so many other people. A person with a world horizon, with a world perspective, but one of these persons, one of these friends was Rudolf Steiner. And we published a little book, as we always do. This, even if they are not, It's German-English, Rudolf Steiner in der Öffentlichkeit, Rudolf Steiner in public life, so the Millers translated. And at the end, there is also the memory, also in the handwriting of Albert Schweitzer. And I will only quote the end of the text. Albert Schweitzer is mainly describing his first encounter with Rudolf Steiner in Strasbourg in 96, so early in their lives. And at the end, he said that they talked about Goethe and Plato and Albert Schweitzer's own research in the Gospels. But then something happened in their conversation. Something quite noteworthy happened. One or the other of us, I no longer know which, came to speak about the intellectual, spiritual decline of culture. And we discovered that we were both concerned with this. Neither of us has expected this from the other. A lively exchange quickly ensued. We discovered from one another that we had each taken up the same thing as a life's task, to strive for the emergence of a true culture ruled by an ideal of humanity, and so encourage people to become truly thinking beings. Conscious of this common bond, we said our goodbye. It was not given to us to meet with one another again, but the consciousness of a common bond remained. Each followed the work of the other. It was not granted me to join in Rudolf Steiner's lofty flights of thought in the spiritual sciences. I know, however, that in this he lifted up many people and made new people of them. Those in his discipleship have accomplished outstanding achievements in so many fields. I have ever and ever again followed the life of Rudolf Steiner with heartfelt interest. The successes up to the time of the First War, the problems and hardships that these brought with them, the efforts to bring about order in the turmoil of the post-war period through the promotion of threefolding the social organism, achieving the establishment of Goetheanum in Dornach, where his world of ideas found a home, the pain brought upon him by the destructive fire during New Year night, 1922-1923, the courage with which he undertook the reconstruction, and finally the greatness of soul he demonstrated through his tireless teaching and creative work during the period of suffering that marked the final month he spent on earth. During my meeting with him, his countenance with his wonderful eyes made an unforgettable impression on me. So a remarkable memory of Albert Schweitzer. There is much more in the text and in the book, but I want to come back to maybe another 10 minutes if you don't mind. There is one huge exception, Albert Schweitzer. It's not the only one I know, but we have to confess, I would say that Christopher Bemper was right. Steiner is still quite unknown. And I want, if you accept 10 further minutes, a little bit to ask why. And in Germany, and maybe the center of negativity is Germany at the moment, it's not only being unknown, but it's totally negative connotated. Maybe not totally, but if Steiner is in the newspaper, then there is the connotation a nationalist, right-winged, anti-Semitic, and so on. This is a standard connotation, racist. I think people who studied Steiner know that it is not true. Partly it's the absolute opposite. But there is a certain recognition for aspects of the fruits of anthroposophy, but Steiner himself is either unknown or rejected in maybe the mainstream media. It is not complete. There are positive exceptions and surprises sometimes. But why is this the case? And is it in a way good for us, as Christopher said, a kind of a protection, or is it something we should try to change? At least try that, make him more public. And what kind of reasons play a role in this situation? And I only wanted to name some points, maybe not the solution but remarkable for me if I think over this phenomenon. We heard about the seeds of Waldorf education. We know that we have more than 1,400 Waldorf schools worldwide, 1,900 kindergartens, and we could name the numbers of the organic farms, of the therapists, of the doctor, the eurythmists, the homes for the handicapped, or curative education, or supportive education, and many other fields. It is still a minority of the bigger society, but such an amount of positive work on all continents. I always remember when the UNESCO stated that the apartheid regime in South Africa was very successful in separating the population, in splitting and creating abysses. As successful, the UNESCO stated, is the Waldorf Teacher Seminar in bringing together what the apartheid separated. So we have such statements, but they are exceptions. And it's not so much known that the most famous Jewish journal after Steiner's death, the most famous Jewish journal in Germany, in an obituary stated that Steiner was a fighter against anti-Semitism and such a noble person and such an exception in Germany. How can it be without now bringing a melancholic atmosphere to our little coming together? But I think it's a good theme for, you are so prominent here, Central Park, Waldorf School. Of course, it's not Steiner, it is Waldorf School, but it's known that there is a connection, and it's not in a way hidden, which is good, as I think. First, I would like to state that I think 100 years is short. For us, it is long, and maybe really longer than our own lifespan. But in the history of science, in the development of scientific thinking, it's not long, not at all. We know it from Aristotle. His works became famous and transforming scientific culture by 1,000 years after he died. It took a long, long time. And even if we think that natural science developments and success, they are more rapid than going speedy in relationship to Aristotle, we know that Galileo Galilei was an outsider in the late Middle Age, in the beginning modern times. At his time, he was a pioneer, but it took centuries till the paradigm of the new natural scientific thinking came to the center of the society. Now it's going fast, but it's more or less the application of this type of thinking. So, of course, the artificial intelligence and the restructuring of society is going incredibly fast, but it's not a new thing. And we know that also this development of artificial intelligence was this was seen since 5 decades from people as Joseph Weizenbaum and others. So maybe the main of the society is shocked or surprised, but not the pioneers themselves. So I would say this is a kind of manifestation of what is described by Steiner in the leading thoughts about the progress of natural scientific thinking. But the paradigm incarnated only after centuries. And insofar maybe it is not such a long time. And maybe we can rewrite history and saying it is enormous progress, because when Steiner died, there was 3, 4, 5 Waldorf schools. One big one in Stuttgart, and then the smaller ones in Germany and ones in the Netherlands. And now at least 1,400. Of course, not enough, but it's the same with the farms, organic farming, the same with anthroposophical medicine. So the seed is growing. And when Steiner died, the perspective was quite depressed, in the sense that the Goetheanum was a ruin. There was just the end of the destruction. The economical situation in Europe was very difficult. The social situation was difficult. The political situation was difficult. If you would have a consideration into the situation of the anthroposophical movement in 1925, you would not have expected that it became an international movement in a totalitarian 20th century. This is for me the second point, to make it very short. It was a dark century from a certain aspect, from a certain point of view. In Europe, 2 world wars and the Holocaust, and this kind of, how to say, for Hannah Arendt, she said, the Jews, they are the first to be destroyed, but there come other populations. So the concept is to eliminate life unworthy to live. And she said, if I wouldn't be a Jew and only witnessing what is going on with them, I would be completely afraid also about my own destiny in the future, or the destiny of other parts of the population which seem not to be so essential for the progress of the society shaped by them. So it was, from the darker side of the aspect, a century Hannah Arendt describes in her famous book about the origins, published in 1951 here in New York. And this is for a school of Michael, of spiritual activity, for a school of freedom, individual freedom, and for new types of associations, state-independent movements, not a good time. This is very simple to understand, that anthroposophy as this kind of impulse, overcoming national states, overcoming these kind of regulations, overcoming dictatorship, had a hard time. So in Harvard, I have to talk about anthroposophical groups under dictatorship, how they behaved. Individual responsibility under dictatorship, or personal responsibility, as Arendt put it. So all in all, we have to say, not a good century for an anthroposophical impulse, but this is only the half of the century, because, as we know, there was also a lot of light in the 20th century, in civil movements, in grassroots movements, in counter movements. It was a century of discovering relations, I and you, what is between us. It was also a century of new forms of living together, life communities, many new models, archetypes of coming together, be in traditional forms, and so on, and so on. I personally am qualified in psychiatry, psychotherapy. It is all 20th century. In the 19th century, of course, we had psychoanalysis, but all these modern schools, and they detected a lot of things about the mystery of between I and you and the mystery of the soul. It is all in a light 20th century. So it's Michaelic in the sense that this is a battlefield. And anthroposophy had in Europe a very hard time during Steiner's lifetime and beyond. And from the point of science, in the United States, hopefully Thomas Kuhn is still known. He was a famous writer in the 70s and 80s, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It was a groundbreaking book about how the progress of science is performed, or better to say, what is hindering, what are obstacles in scientific progress, or better to say, maybe in bringing the truth to the surface. He's saying the paradigmas, the paradigmatic styles and the laws of science says, and science, quite often scientists or political scientists, they define what is science and what is not science. So I think in the sense of Thomas Kuhn, even if he probably would have not named it, anthroposophy is an unconventional new science and kept down and restricted by the strong paradigmas of existing science. But I wouldn't say this is really in science. This is also a mixture of science, society, and industry. Because industry has a certain interest in a specific scientific approach, which is ending in technology. And all other approaches, which probably are not so close to profit, they were suppressed. And in a way, what is sometimes in the main media is probably part of the reflection. Where is the power? Also, the power of public opinion. It was one of the very sad experience of Hannah Arendt's last maybe 10 years. It started earlier. It started before Nixon. That she had the feeling that the United States of America, they are distancing more and more from their own origins. And because she was so fascinated, as you know, that it's not a national state, that the United States of America, this is a new type of a society. She was never naive and romantic, but she studied the history of this country and society in detail, and she realized that there is a shift. Something is happening, and maybe you know that some years before she died, the Pentagon Papers, when it came out, this kind of propaganda for the Vietnam War, that it was mainly directed by interests who manipulate public opinion. And this was for Hannah Arendt an extreme sad thing, because in a way she had so much trust in public opinion. In public, not in a superficial sense, superficial aspect, but really that we come together, the public sphere, and then if the public opinion becomes the target of a kind of profis in advertising, how to change the brains, how to create a public opinion. This was for her one of the most, and was her last speech in the big Boston Hall, Ford Hall, 200 years of US Revolution and the reality of United States of America in 1975, not 50 years later. So for Steiner, this was also a very important point, anthroposophy in the public. But I won't end with these depressing elements, but I think these are all elements of the situation we have to face, and also the consideration we have to take in mind. I want to end in saying that there is still a lot of things to discover in Steiner's work. And maybe because, yes, last time Hannah Arendt, it was so wonderful when she said, I think it was in her dissertation or even earlier, about Augustine, she wrote that his work, after more than 1,500 years, could still be discovered. And this would require helping and understanding attentive care. I think this is, for me, it is a leading thought that even Dr. Steiner's work can be discovered, but it needs a kind of understanding, attentive care, an inner understanding, an inner mood of the soul. And I'm working in the general anthroposophical section, not in the education department. So this faculty of the School for Spiritual Science, who is responsible for anthroposophy itself, not for medicine, not for education, just for anthroposophy, including Steiner himself. And I think it's very important for the future students of anthroposophy, and we are glad that we have also at the Goetheanum an international English-speaking course for deeper understanding of anthroposophy, that so many students came every year to the Goetheanum to learn to study Steiner. And it's really at 8 o'clock in the morning that they start the day with reading texts of Steiner together. And for some of them, it's a big discovery to read texts. And they are not all Waldorf school pupils. And some really, I know it from the university where I'm teaching, they lost the ability to read and to study. And we can complain and say, oh God, it's all over. There's no more knowledge. And at university, I speak about Rilke. Nobody knows Rilke. I speak about Paul Celan. Nobody knows. It's incredible. They're all qualified at schools. And even the names are gone. But sometimes I think maybe it's a new beginning. If the old type of education of Humboldt is gone, and there is nothing anymore there, maybe the good thing is an openness for a new encounter, because it's not a burden of tradition. Even I think it would be good if they know Goethe. But if they don't know, it could be the first encounter. And this is sometimes very touching with reading with them or discussing with them. Sometimes it's the first encounter with such a perspective, such a thought, such a sentence, such a word. And for me, it's the beginning of a new world of the future. So even if we see the abysses of the 20th century, also the forces which are not enthusiastic for anthroposophy, which hinder, and this is tragic because anthroposophy would be so helpful, not just for anthroposophical hospitals, for all hospitals. It is not, from my understanding, not a special thing for a special group. It's a remedy. And anthroposophy could play an important role also in state schools, in state university hospitals, and must not be all in our style. So the hinderings that this penetrates more the culture are tragic. So it belongs to the evil forces, I would say. But even if we see it with all the consequences, we also see that in this difficult situation, there is this, what we heard about, the seeds and the new beginnings. So I hope that this little image from Albert Schweitzer, Henry Barnes, Bruno Walter, Friedrich Hebel, and then a little bit about this wonderful from Gabun, from Lambarene came the appreciation of ethical thinking. And then I try to describe a little bit what I see as hinderings, that we are still such a small group and have kind of a private property, but anthroposophy is nothing else than a private property. It's a public element. Michael is not belonging to a special group. So I think it is belonging to the world, it is embracing the world, but we have to face the forces of evil. But at the end, I said, this shouldn't drive us into depression, but see that we can start anew. And sometimes it's in a small dialogue, or it's with a student or a high school student, but also a university student, or with a non-student person, where a single new word, a single new sentence, a single new perspective can create a new world. So maybe Steiner and anthroposophy is in the public, maybe not in the public media, but I think that such a school is so wonderful because you have children and students and they go out, and we have so many good places where these seeds go in the world. So I think that there is hope, all in all. So now hope is that's the end. Yes, that I stop, and thank you for not running away. And yeah, now it's open for conversation, questions, comments, and 2 different lectures, contributions, but maybe there is something coming together, what we try to bring from, not from the Goethe Ahnung, but from the perspective which we shared. Thank you very much.